Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Association of Anaesthetists evening webinar. My name is Dr. Thomas James. I'm the past chair of the Association of Anaesthetists SAS committee, so I'll be chairing this session, which, as you know, is talking about the new SAS contracts, the specialist role aimed at SAS anaesthetists and those who manage them. So many thanks to all of you for joining us. We have about 230 people booked onto this evening's webinar, so thank you so much for giving up your time on this miserable winter's evening. For those, if you wish to watch again, or those who have registered but unable to make it tonight, there will be a link to the recording sent out tomorrow. There are, of course, too many of us to have our microphones on, so microphones are all switched off. Any questions for speakers, please ask via the question option on your control panel, which you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be doing questions at the end of the session after all three talks. You can use the orange arrows on the top of your control panel to reduce size of the control panels. Please be aware this is an educational scientific meeting, so if you're going to report it outside, please do responsibly, accurately provide the contents of any statements. Very occasionally with pre-recorded talks, and all our talks are actually pre-recorded because of various Wi-Fi issues and etc. Very occasionally attendees are not able to see recorded talks. It happens, there's a document in the handout section of the webinar which will contain links to recording. If you click on that handout, then the link, the video will play. So that's my brief preamble. Thank you very much for joining our talk. As you know, these contracts have been long in the evolution. It's a big deal. The last change in the SAS doctor contracts were in 2008, and almost immediately since then has been a clamour for reform, both around the pay scale, the changes to the specialty doctor contract, and also the absence of any kind of senior SAS role. And so this new contract, which has been brought in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, involves changes into the specialty doctor grade, a change to a pay scale, and it reintroduces a senior grade to the specialist, which is similar but not identical to the old associate specialist grade. If anyone's viewing us from Scotland, negotiations are at an early stage with the Scottish contracts. So the aim of this webinar is to provide us some details around the new contracts, how these changes might affect SAS anaesthetists, how these changes might affect managers and those who may wish to think about changing into a SAS career. We're also going to talk specifically about the specialist grade, what makes a specialist anaesthetist from a specialty doctoral consultant, and we're going to make the case for the contracts and specialist roles from individual doctors. We've got people from individual doctors, people from local negotiating committees and clinical directors. So hopefully this will be a benefit to specialty doctors who believe they're already working specialists to have some conversations and to work out how their career might progress forward. So I'm going to introduce first of all our first speaker, who's speaking recordedly. This is Dr. Emma Wayne, and she's talking about the new contracts. Emma is an associate specialist, and she's also chair of her LNC at the Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt Orthopaedic Hospital in Oswestry in Shropshire. Emma graduated from the St Mary's Medical School in 1996. She's worked as a SAS anaesthetist since 2007. She joined our SAS committee in the association in 2019 and was elected to the board in 2021. So thank you very much for Emma for speaking about the new contracts, and I shall hand over to Emma for her video now.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. My name's Emma Wayne. I'm an associate specialist at the Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt Orthopaedic Hospital in Gabowen in Shropshire, where I'm the chair of the LNC. I'm also an elected board member and a member of the SAS committee at the Association of Anaesthetists. So prior to starting, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping on behalf of all of us. Although this talk is obviously about contracts and terms and conditions, the Association of Anaesthetists isn't a trade union. We've done our best to give you up-to-date factual information, and it's all being given in good faith. But before making any decisions about your future employment, it's important that you consult a trade union first if you have any concerns or questions. The webinar this evening is about new SAS contracts for SAS anaesthetists and those who manage them. I'm going to start us off by giving some factual information about the new contract and how we've got to where we've got to now. So the SAS grade, who's included in this? This includes SAS doctors with the title staff grades, associate specialists, specialty doctors, and from 2021 the specialist, which is the new grade that's been introduced, which you'll hear a lot more about later. However, there are a lot more doctors working with various different titles, including clinical fellows, trusted associate specialists, trust grades, who might be considered to be comparable to SAS grades, and these are known as locally employed doctors. Probably in anaesthetics, there are now more locally employed doctors than there are SAS doctors. But the key difference here is that these are not nationally recognised grades, and this is important for reasons that I'll come on to in a little while. So let's move on to some detail about the new contracts. The new SAS contract was introduced in England, Wales and Northern Ireland from April 2021, and I believe negotiations are still ongoing in Scotland about it. It replaced the 2008 contract, which was the first to introduce the specialty doctors as a single SAS grade for that contract. Prior to 2008, the associate specialist contract dated from 1981 and the staff grades contract from 1987. So you can see, looking at those timescales, how important the introduction of a new contract is in any individual's career, and often will be a once in a career opportunity. Let's move on to some key points from the 2008 contract which help explain how we've got to where we've got to today. The associate specialist grade was closed, so this removed the senior level from that grade and took away the opportunity for staff grades to feel they had a chance to progress in their careers. The specialty doctor replaced the staff grade as the title. A single pay spine for specialty doctors was introduced with 2 thresholds to pass through in addition to the normal incremental pay levels. Those who met the criteria for being an associate specialist were given a window of opportunity to regrade. However, not all trusts allowed individuals who met these criteria to regrade. It actually still was a relatively rare thing to be able to move on. So although the associate specialist existed, it wasn't a given that somebody who felt they were working as an associate specialist would be allowed to regrade to become one. So what are the common themes to the 2008 and the 2021 contracts? All SAS doctors should work to an agreed job plan. All job plans consist of what are known as programmed activities, or PAs. A PA consists of 4 hours activity of normal time. 10 PAs is full time. So if you only worked Monday to Friday during the daytime hours, 40 hours would be a full-time week. PAs are broadly divided into direct clinical care, DCC, and supporting professional activities, SPA. SAS doctors are unique in having a contractual right to SPA time, with the right to 1 SPA session per week, although obviously more can be negotiated if appropriate. Although I've said 10 PAs is full-time, you can work more than 10 PAs by mutual agreement. A PA outside core hours consists of 3 hours, not 4. What are the key differences with the 2021 contract? Well, probably the most important is the reintroduction of a senior grade, the specialist, and Rob's going to tell us much more about that in a little while. The core hours have been increased slightly. They've changed from 7 AM to 7 PM to 7 AM to 9 PM Monday to Friday. SAS doctors now have been given an additional day of annual leave after 7 years in the grade in England, and this has corrected the situation where SAS doctors were the only employees within the NHS who weren't given any additional annual leave in reward for loyalty. There's now a flatter pay schedule with ultimately 5 pay points compared with the current 11. This is taking a little bit of time to unwind, but will be in place from 2023. There's 1 threshold for progression for specialty doctors now, not 2, between pay points 3 and 4. I'll give a little bit more information about that in a minute. The on-call availability supplement for those who do on-call from home is now in line with the consultants. So broadly speaking, there's category A and category B. Category A requires immediate presence in the hospital or immediate telephone advice. Category B is advice or presence that can wait for an unspecified period of time, and there are the same percentage uplifts which are based on the on-call frequency. There's now no right to decline elective work in premium time. This is actually only applicable to those transferring from the associate specialist grade, because they were the only people who had this right. Specialty doctors didn't in any case. And there's the introduction of the Sas Advocate. This is not a mandatory part of the contract, but trusts are being encouraged to appoint somebody who will speak up on behalf of SAS doctors, who SAS doctors can go to for advice about their contract, their career progression, if they're having difficulties. And I think it's hoped this will align more with the SAS tutor role, who obviously have been there in a more educational capacity. There's now a defined limit on out of hours work, so 60% must be in core hours, and this is quite an important achievement to stop SAS doctors being used predominantly with their job plan just running out of hours. There's a maximum of 4 consecutive nights, 4 consecutive long days, 46 hours minimum before and after the transition between day and night shifts, and no more than 13 weekends a year. A weekend counts as 12 midnight going from Friday to Saturday to 23:59 on Sunday, so i.e. the 48 hours of Saturday and Sunday. What's the requirements to be appointable as a specialty doctor? You need full registration with the GMC, 4 years full-time postgraduate medical work, of which at least 2 have been in the relevant specialty. For those who would wish to become specialists, the requirements to be appointable as a specialist are full registration with the GMC and a minimum of 12 years full-time postgraduate medical work, of which at least 6 have been in the relevant specialty. The implementation of any new contract, as I'm sure you can envisage, is quite a complicated process, and this was no different for this contract. So the transfer to the new contract was offered to all SAS doctors who were on national terms and conditions, i.e. it didn't include locally employed doctors, and that was why earlier I drew your attention to the important distinction between the two. All those on SAS contracts were given a 6-month window of opportunity to express a wish to transfer. This finished on the 30th of September in England, 31st of October in Northern Ireland, and the 30th of November in Wales. And there were obviously delays with this contract. The agreement to introduce it was done very soon before the April introduction of it. Obviously, the pandemic also led to really quite significant delays. So some employers extended this deadline, although no employers were mandated to. Transferring after this date is at the employer's discretion. And the key difference between the 2008 and the 2021 contract is the lack of an opportunity to regrade to the senior contract, the specialist. The associate specialist was a grade that was being withdrawn, so it was felt reasonable to give people the chance to move over to a grade that was going to disappear if they met the criteria. However, the specialist has been introduced. It is going to be something that is going to be present certainly for the foreseeable future, and I think people will be able to transfer as appropriate under the terms of that contract. So what were the unforeseen consequences? Because they always exist with any process. There was an unexpected pay award of 3% following a recommendation from the DDRB for all doctors in 2021. Unfortunately, this doesn't apply to those on the 2021 contract, as the pay uplifts were already included within the pay scales. So the 2021 specialty doctor pay scale was designed so that no one would see their pay decrease through transferring. But this pay award meant that a lot of people would see their pay decrease in the first year having transferred over. In Wales, a pay continuity arrangement was reached so that specialty doctors could benefit from the 3% pay increase and not experience this reduction in basic pay, but this was only as long as interest had been expressed before the 30th of November. Let's go into a bit more detail about the pay progression, because obviously that matters to all of us, that we move up every year or every 2 years as appropriate. And this is different for specialty doctors and for specialists, both in terms of the standard requirements and in terms of the presence of a threshold. So specialty doctors, there are 2 forms of pay progression. There's the standard, and I'll give the details of that in a minute, and then there's a higher threshold, and I'll give the details of what is needed for that between pay points 3 and 4. And then for specialists, there's just a standard pay progression, but this does differ from the standard pay progression for specialty doctors. The standard pay progression for specialty doctors: you must have participated satisfactorily in annual job planning process, participated satisfactorily in appraisal, undertaken completion of your trust mandatory training every year, have no formal capability processes in place, and no live disciplinary sanctions on record. And I don't think these differ particularly from the pay progression criteria that are currently in place. The higher pay progression for specialty doctors, well, all the standard conditions as above must have been met, but the individual needs to have demonstrated an increasing ability to take decisions and carry responsibility without direct supervision, and to demonstrate contributions to a wider role, for example, management and leadership, teaching and training, representative work, and audit. But I would hope that these are things that people would be demonstrating through the way that they progress as they get more experience in their role in any case. So the standard pay progression for specialists includes a lot of the same things as those for specialty doctors, but has some additional criteria on top. So you must have participated satisfactorily in the annual job planning process, participated satisfactorily in annual medical appraisal, undertaken anonymous colleague and patient multi-source feedback since your appointment or your last pay progression, performed a full audit cycle into a chosen aspect of your personal clinical practice and demonstrated any identified learning need has been addressed, demonstrated an ability to deliver learning to others, for example, by completing training to become a clinical or educational supervisor. The notes say that you can also do this by delivering one lecture. So I'm not sure that in reality, this will be a particularly onerous task to demonstrate. Completed the trust mandatory training annually, have no formal capability process in place, and no live disciplinary sanction on record. So the pay progression date is the date an individual started in that grade, or the existing incremental date for those who've transferred over from a contract with national terms and conditions of service. But there is a key difference now in how pay progression works, which I will try to explain. So prior to this contract, pay points at payroll were open. So payroll had to be told not to allow you to progress. From April 2023, pay points are going to be closed, i.e. payroll will close it off after you've been given your increment, and they have to be told to open it. So it's a bit more like an opt-in, opt-out. So previously we were on an opt-out, payroll had to be told to stop it. However, now it's much more of an opt-in, they have to be told to allow it. So CDs and medical directors are responsible for ensuring that processes are in place to sign off pay progression. Clinical managers must ensure that the pay progression completion process is signed off in a timely fashion, and doctors shouldn't be penalised if any element of the progression criteria has not been met for reasons beyond their control. So I would say that if this is something that concerns you, it might be worth having a word with your LNC or with your CD to ask them what system they're putting in place to make sure this happens, because the key part of this is you should not be unreasonably penalised, and it's very important that that doesn't happen. In summary, the introduction of a new contract is a rare event. Moving contracts is a personal decision, as no one size fits all, and it's really important that you understand the detail of a contract and how it will affect you before you decide to move over onto it. Although I can see that some of what I've said here might seem negative, it's important to see that some really positive opportunities exist here. The reintroduction of a senior grade was much wanted and long overdue, and it does give SAS doctors the chance to progress in their career and move up to a more senior grade as appropriate. So moving from specialty doctor to specialist is a really important introduction. It also gives locally employed doctors the opportunity to talk to their trusts and to say, there's a new contract that's come in, could I move over onto it? Because this will put them on national terms and conditions, which does give you some important protections. The requirements in the contract, especially with regard to the pay progression, can seem onerous, but actually they can be used to persuade your employers to give you opportunities and fulfil their responsibilities to you for your career progression. It can be very difficult for SAS doctors to be given chances in their departments to take on roles and to be given responsibilities, but this actually says to the trusts, you should be doing this for these people, and if you don't do it for them, they are to suffer no detriment as a result. Personally, I think it's important to bring this up at your annual appraisal and your annual job planning meeting. If there's an area of special interest you want to pursue, then discuss it with your appraiser and with your clinical lead or your CD, and they will hopefully, given this, give you the opportunity to do so. Please remember, advice from your union, whichever one you're a member of, is always helpful. So thank you all very much for listening this evening. If you have any questions that you would rather ask me privately than in the discussion, then here is my email address, and please do feel free to email me. But I'm also happy to attempt to answer anything tonight that I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that talk. There were some brilliant insights into the contract, the process behind it, and what some of the more detailed terms and conditions that perhaps some of us haven't looked at beyond the headline rates of pay and so on. So thank you very much for that. As I said, there will be questions. We'll do questions for everybody at the end of all three talks. We've had a few comments in the questions about volume. All the talks are pre-recorded, so the broadcast volume is set and is coming out on most of us all right. So if you're having problems hearing it, I suspect it's probably more of a local problem. So do just check your check that, or if not, click on the Vimeo link to check for a pre-record of it. So apologies if people are struggling with that, but we can't change a lot about that. I apologize. So our next talk is from Dr. Rob Fleming. Rob Fleming is a specialty doctor in Sherwood Forest Hospital in Nottinghamshire. He's the current chair of the SAS committee at the Association of Anaesthetists, and he's also, along with Emma, the other SAS board member of the Association of Anaesthetists. And he's going to talk to us about what is a specialist, as am I one? And I suspect there'll be a lot of us online wanting to hear this talk and find out the answer to that. So Rob, thank you very much. And as again, Rob's talk is pre-recorded.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Rob Fleming. I'm a specialty doctor anaesthetist working in Sherwood Forest Hospitals in North Nottinghamshire, and I'm the current chair of the Association SAS Committee. My talk tonight is entitled, What is a Specialist Anaesthetist? Am I one? And I think before I move off the first slide, it's probably important to say that I am not one. Like the majority of the audience tonight, I suspect, I am a specialty doctor who would like the opportunity to become a specialist, which is why we've arranged this webinar tonight, and certainly the basis of why I've created this talk. Providing a little bit of history and context to all of this, prior to 2009, there were a variety of SAS contracts that someone could be employed on, and these included the associate specialist role, which was the senior SAS role. In 2009, this role closed to new entry, and anyone appointed to a SAS role since then has been appointed as a specialty doctor. So the majority of SAS anaesthetists certainly now are probably specialty doctors. Many of us have become very senior, experienced and independent in the role. Many of us work alongside associate specialists who were created before or during that regrading window, but we have been unable to see recognition of our seniority. Recognising this, some trusts have created a trust or local associate specialists in the meantime, and many organisations, including the Royal College of Anaesthetists, have called for reopening of the associate specialist role. And that's not what's happened, but something similar has happened. So last year, a new senior SAS role, the specialist, was opened for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and I believe negotiations are still going on in Scotland. The BMA and NHS employers have gone to great lengths to say that this is not the same as the associate specialist role. This is not a reopening of the associate specialist role, but as a senior SAS grade, it is likely to fill a similar niche. And in keeping with that, existing associate specialists have been offered to transition over to the specialist contract, assuming they meet the eligibility criteria. However, existing specialty doctors, even if they're undertaking the same role as associate specialists within their department, do not have this opportunity. In order for an existing specialty doctor to become a specialist, a job must be created and advertised, even if a doctor meets all the criteria and is already working in the capacity of a specialist, which is an interesting situation to find ourselves in. According to NHS employers, the introduction of the new specialist role is designed to provide incentivisation for career development, an opportunity for career progression for highly experienced specialty doctors. But these things are only true if jobs are created in order to recognise that progression where it has occurred. So it's very important that we do try and delineate what makes a specialist, so that if you achieve it, you can have the conversation with your employer, hopefully have a job created that recognises your seniority so that you can see this recognition and this career progression. So I think therefore it's important that we try and define what a specialist anaesthetist is. Now the rest of the talk is going to be based on the concepts of experience, seniority and independence for reasons that will become clear in a moment. I'm also going to try and answer some of the more common questions that have been asked to me as somebody with an interest in this. And these questions include, do you have to have the FRCA? What is the difference between a specialty doctor and a specialist? Is a specialist the same as a consultant? And if I occasionally need help, does this mean I can't be a specialist? And hopefully over the course of the talk, I will answer these questions. In making this talk, I pulled together various resources because quite a lot has been published now about the specialist role, both from the trade union side of things and from the employment side of things. The Royal College of Anaesthetists have also published a few bits and pieces that are helpful here, including a generic person specification for a specialist doctor. But also the college have produced guidance on supervision arrangements for anaesthetists, and various aspects of the GPAS standards are helpful as well. I've drawn in some bits from the GMC, and I've also been keeping a very close eye on the specialist anaesthetist posts that have been advertised so far, as anyone who follows me on Twitter will know. So there have been around a dozen specialist anaesthetist posts advertised so far. So this talk is also based around what has been created so far. So the things that I'm saying, a lot of these things are backed up by the fact that an employer somewhere has made the precedent, has established the precedent by advertising a job that describes what I'm going to say in the rest of this talk too. So firstly, broadly, what is a specialist? BMA and NHS employers have both published a variety of things about this, and they've both described a specialist in simple terminology as a senior and experienced clinician who will work autonomously or independently. But these are the kinds of words that have been used to describe a specialist in all of the publications that have been created so far. And we're going to cover each of these things in turn. So experience, seniority, and independence. So experience in some ways is the easiest one to deal with, because there is a minimum time requirement in order to be considered to be appointable as a specialist. So you must have completed 12 years postgraduate experience. You must have done 12 years as a doctor, 6 of which need to have been in your own or relevant specialty, ideally as a Sas doctor, but equivalent years experience from other medical grades or from overseas will also be counted. So 12 years as a doctor, 6 as an anaesthetist is a good ballpark minimum. However, obviously not everyone who's done 12 years as a doctor and 6 as an anaesthetist will be working as a specialist or will want to. So that brings us next on to seniority. Now, it's probably at this point worth reminding everyone what makes a specialty doctor. So in order to become a specialty doctor, you only need to have completed 4 years postgraduate experience, 2 as a trainee or equivalent in your or a relevant specialty. So if being a specialist requires 12 years as a doctor and 6 years as an anaesthetist, being a specialty doctor requires 4 years as a doctor, 2 as an anaesthetist. So if your usual expectations of a specialty doctor is that they are a senior doctor, that may reflect the fact that an awful lot of your specialty doctors are very experienced and senior, and they would perhaps better off be badged as a specialist, or more appropriately badged as a specialist, because the specialty doctor role should be open to fairly junior doctors. And once you've been a specialty doctor for a little while, there are various pay thresholds in the old contract and a single pay threshold in the new contract. And passing through that higher pay threshold in the new contract requires demonstrating an increasing ability to take decisions and carry responsibility without direct supervision. So compare and contrast this with the phrasing that's used to describe a specialist, where the wording is independence or autonomy. If you are a specialty doctor, if you are an inexperienced specialty doctor with an expectation of direct supervision, if you are a more experienced specialty doctor with an expectation of indirect supervision, but supervision should still be occurring. Whereas if you are a specialist, there is an expectation of independence or autonomy. The BMA have produced a nice role comparison table. And again, this describes the specialist as falling in between the specialty doctor and consultant roles. So in order to answer one of the questions from one of those earlier slides, is a specialist the same as a consultant? No, it isn't. A specialist is a senior Sas doctor, and that does not necessarily mean being able to work as a consultant in all aspects of their work. However, there is an expectation that a specialist is a senior and experienced clinician who will work and provide expertise in a specialised area. Within their niche, they may function as a consultant, but there is not an expectation that that niche will be as broad as consultants working in the same department necessarily. And this is backed up by NHS employers, who again have described how the specialist falls in between the specialty doctor and consultant roles, and says that a specialist has a greater amount of expertise, responsibility, decision-making competence, will be responsible for the patients under their care. However, will perhaps be an expert in a narrower field to a consultant and will work independently within their defined area of practice, whereas a consultant has an expectation of working independently within all areas within their entire specialty. You can debate whether that is true, but that is how it is described by NHS employers and the BMA. So in order to demonstrate your seniority, another eligibility requirement for being appointed as a specialist is meeting the essential requirements of the Generic Capabilities Framework. Now, the Generic Capabilities Framework is based on another GMC document that is used to create postgraduate medical curricula, so is used to create training programs. And in the same way, we expect trainees to demonstrate that they have met criteria in order to enter onto the specialist register. We require someone who wants to be a specialist to be able to demonstrate that they have met requirements of a senior doctor. The Generic Capabilities Framework is split broadly into 6 headings, which are listed on the slide. And the Generic Capabilities Framework forms the basis of the Royal College template generic specialist person specification, which we will cover over the next few slides. So, the Royal College template person specification again says that postgraduate professional qualification in anaesthesia might be a marker of seniority. It might be desirable, but it is not an essential component of being recognised as a specialist. And it's important to recognise that this is true of existing associate specialists as well. Exams have never formed part of describing what a senior Sas doctor is. The ability to complete exams is nice, and there are a number of specialty doctors who do have the FRCA, or the European Diploma in Anaesthesia and Intensive Care. And while this might be a marker of them as senior doctors, it is not an essential requirement of becoming a specialist. However, what is an essential requirement of becoming a specialist is the ability to provide safe and effective general regional anaesthesia and procedural sedation independently for all patients. And again, it's probably worth further clarifying that from the Generic Capabilities Framework, that these capabilities should be mapped to the setting and scope of the role. There is an expectation that specialists will be independent within their niche. So whatever their niche is, they need to be able to practice independently within that niche. This does not necessarily mean demonstrating that they are able to practice independently within every niche. I hope that makes sense. So looking at the rest of the person specification, clinical leadership is an essential part of being a senior doctor. If you're going to be appointed as a specialist, you need to be able to lead teams. And I think, again, this can be empowering. If you are identified and successfully appointed as a specialist, this should place you on even footing with a consultant surgeon. I think within many operating theatres, there may be a recognisable power differential between a consultant surgeon operating and a specialty doctor anaesthetist anaesthetising for them. If you are identified as a specialist, there is an expectation that you are a leader within your team, every bit as much as a consultant. Again, moving on to the other non-clinical aspects, so considerable service development or quality improvement projects, be they local or national, would be a marker of someone who is functioning as a senior doctor. However, these things fall in the desirable column rather than the essential column. Likewise, roles in formal education or research might demonstrate that you are a senior doctor, but if these aren't necessarily parts of your role, they are desirable, not essential. So to kind of try and sum this up, it's important that capability is mapped to the requirements of the role, because a specialist is an expert in a narrower field and will work independently within their defined area of practice. Non-clinical activities and roles that might normally be undertaken by a consultant colleague should be considered evidence that a specialty doctor may be more appropriately badged as a specialist. But again, this needs to be balanced against the fact that not all specialists or consultants will be involved in all such roles. And while a specialist should have the opportunity to carry out wider roles and would be encouraged to do so, you should have the same ability to not do these as a consultant colleague. I hope that makes sense. So if we've talked a bit about seniority and we've talked a bit about experience, this brings us on to independence, which is a little bit more of a tricky subject. So I think many specialty doctor anaesthetists are undertaking their own lists solo, and whatever solo means varies from one department to the next. Many specialty doctor anaesthetists are writing a consultant's name down on their anaesthetic chart, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are in fact being supervised. The Royal College of Anaesthetists have produced a very helpful guideline on supervision arrangements for anaesthetists that replaces previous descriptors such as direct or indirect or local or distant into levels of supervision. And again, I'll leave this slide up for a minute and waffle on for a minute to give everyone a chance to digest it if they haven't seen it before. This describes how you might transition from being a directly supervised, more junior anaesthetist to being an indirectly supervised anaesthetist to being someone who works with true independence or autonomy. And there is an expectation that trainees will progress from 1 to 4 over the course of training and then become 5 when they are consultants. I think the same is true for specialty doctors. However, that progression is perhaps less readily recognised. Specialty doctors who have had their own lists for a very long time may still be writing someone's name on their anaesthetic chart, but actually that supervision may not stand up to scrutiny. And there is a test of whether or not that supervision stands up to scrutiny. So Francis Cappuccini unfortunately died from a postpartum hemorrhage in 2012 while under the care of a Sas Advocate, and the coroner in that case noticed that supervision arrangements for the trust were undefined and inadequate. The Cappuccini Test arose from this, and it is designed to highlight issues relating to supervision of anaesthetists who aren't working autonomously. It wasn't designed for what I'm about to suggest, but it perhaps provides a useful marker to measure your current supervision arrangements against. So the Cappuccini Test is as follows. If you are being supervised, who is supervising you, and how would you get hold of them if you needed to now? And if you've named your supervisor, if we were to go and ask them, would they know that they are supervising you? Would they know what you are doing? And would they know of any issues that you are concerned about? And if you required their help, would they be able to help you? This is a marker of what good supervision arrangements look like. And if you've not been identified as someone who is working independently or autonomously, your supervision arrangements should pass the Cappuccini standard. And if they don't, either your supervision arrangements are currently inadequate, if you require supervision, you aren't receiving it, or you are in fact working independently, whether or not someone else's name ends up on your anaesthetic chart. And just for clarification, specialist anaesthetist jobs have already been advertised nationally that have specified that they require the ability to work at supervision level 4 or 5. So if that's a marker for whether or not your normal practice is independent, the next question then I guess is, if you've been identified as an independent anaesthetist, are you still able to ask for help? If you are appointed as a specialist successfully, does that mean you have to work entirely under your own steam all the time? And I think the answer here is no, because that isn't true of consultants either. The GMC duties of a doctor are a very important standard and probably are more important than most of the other documents I've talked about here. Good doctors make the care of their patients their first concern, and you must be competent in all aspects of your work, but also it is very important that you recognise and work within the limits of your competence. If you are a specialist, that does not, or a consultant, or a junior doctor, that does not mean that you cannot ask for help. In fact, you should do, always. You should never work beyond the limits of your competence, regardless of what it says on your badge. This is backed up quite nicely by the Royal College GPAS standards, which again say that departments should always have a nominated anaesthetist immediately available to provide cover in the clinical emergencies, as well as advice and support to other anaesthetists, and that is all anaesthetists, regardless of role or grade. If a second opinion or practical help would improve the situation, you should be empowered to ask for it, and this is whether you're a specialty doctor or a specialist. But needing occasionally to ask for help or ask for support does not mean that you are not a senior anaesthetist. Being recognised as a specialist or a consultant should not prevent you from, should never prevent you from asking for help or make you or force you to work beyond the limits of your capabilities. I hope that is clear. So, to summarise where we are so far, am I a specialist? Well, do you meet the time requirements? because if you haven't done 12 years as a doctor, 6 as an anaesthetist, then you cannot be appointed as a specialist. Are you a senior SAS doctor? So do you have areas of your practice, be they clinical or non-clinical, which would otherwise be undertaken by a consultant? Can you map your current role to the generic capabilities framework and the RCOA person specification? Can you demonstrate the things that are required of a specialist that you are already demonstrating? And independence. Are you being supervised? Have you already been identified as an autonomously practicing anaesthetist in some areas of your work? Because if you have, then you have a very strong argument that you are already working as a specialist and your department has already recognised it. If you have not already been recognised as working independently or autonomously, would your current supervision arrangements pass the Cappuccini test? And if they wouldn't, that suggests that either your current supervision arrangements aren't adequate, or you are in fact already working independently. And if you are already working independently, that ought to be recognised by allowing you to become a specialist. So, if we've covered what a specialist is, what might a specialist job look like? And this one is kind of largely, I guess, directed towards the clinical directors who might be in the audience tonight. Good evening, welcome. If you're an experienced specialty doctor, a specialist job might look an awful lot like your current role. All of these roles should have an expectation of daytime autonomy or independence equivalent to supervision level 4 or 5. And these roles could be advertised with a subspecialty interest if that is the area of, if that is the niche area that you provide or that your department wants. You can advertise a job that says you need a regional anaesthetist or you need an obstetric anaesthetist, or you could advertise a job that's a more general role for another senior pair of hands. It's quite important though that whatever job you advertise, 60% of work should be planned to be in standard working hours. The new SAS contracts, both the specialist and the specialty doctor contract, specify that 60% of your work should occur during standard hours. Only 40% should be occurring, or less, should be occurring out of hours. And that is true whether or not you are a specialist or a specialty doctor. Out of hours component varies, and jobs have been advertised so far falling into one of two groups broadly. So roughly half the jobs have been advertised with no nights, but with weekend elective or emergency lists, such as CPOD or trauma. However, again, the terms and conditions of service of the 2021 contracts specify that no more than 13 weekends a year should be worked. The other half of specialist jobs that have been advertised so far include full shift resident rater, supported, so either covering obstetrics or covering ICU or covering, a senior emergency tier, supported by a non-resident consultant colleague at home. But again, no more than 40% of work should occur out of hours. Down the line, or perhaps now even, some specialists may become part of non-resident consultant, in inverted commas, type rotors. However, if this isn't your current role, this should not be a barrier for you to be recognised as a specialist. As we've already talked about, the consultant and specialist roles are different, at least as they are described by the BMA and by NHS employers. There is no contractual reason why a specialist could not progress to being on a non-resident consultant type rota. However, that should not be the argument for saying that your current work is not the work of a specialist. I hope that makes sense. So, in summary, a specialist anaesthetist is a senior, experienced SAS doctor capable of working independently within their niche areas of expertise, or more generally. It is no more than that, it is no less than that, that is what it is. This niche will vary between individuals and may be smaller than that of a consultant, or it may not. Even within their areas of expertise, specialists, just like consultants, should still be empowered to ask for support if they need it. Labeling someone as a specialist does not mean that you are empowering them to work beyond the limits of their ability. Specialists should have the same opportunity to undertake non-clinical roles as a consultant, and they should have the same opportunity to turn them down. A specialist is a senior colleague, so if they are already working in that capacity, recognise them as a senior colleague and treat them as such. Good luck to everyone. Thank you very much for coming again. Good evening all. I quite enjoyed pre-recording that. It's much nicer watching myself than trying to speak. So the thing that we're going to do before we move on to the next talk, we are going to have a few poll discussions, a few poll questions. And the answer to these will hopefully feed into the panel discussion at the end. And also we'll take what you say away and use it to decide how we channel our energies for the SAS committee going forward on this particular topic. And so hopefully Andrew is going to set me up with some poll questions. Andrew, lovely stuff. So this one is for only the specialty doctors in attendance. Would you like to become a specialist? Based on how I've just described it, would you like to be one? So if you could select your options now, we'll give you 30 seconds or so to get your answers in. I can't see the answers coming in, so I'm assuming that they are. There we go. Lovely stuff. That sounds fairly promising. And then the next question, Andrew. So for those who already meet the experience requirements, so for those of you, those specialty doctors out there who are 12 years as a doctor, 6 years as an anaesthetist, do you think that your current role already matches the description of a specialist? And I will give you guys a moment to get your answers in. Apparently, as an organiser, I'm not allowed to vote. That's disappointing. I probably skewed the result. So 84% of existing specialty doctors who meet the requirements think they're already working as specialists. Okie dokie. Next question, please, Andrew. So this is what I'm really interested in. Have you already had a conversation about that with a medical manager? So if you are a specialty doctor who meets the time requirements, have you already had a conversation with one of your medical managers about how you might go about becoming a specialist? Again, I'll give you guys a minute or so to get your answers in. Okie dokie. So the majority have not. So 56% said no. So I think maybe that'll form part of the panel discussion later. We can talk about what the barriers are to having those conversations. And then last question, please, Andrew. So has this presentation made you feel more able to have that conversation? And this is a question entirely designed for my vanity. Lovely stuff. Marvelous. Well, that's good to know. Okie dokie. So we will feed some of those answers and some of those poll answers into the panel discussion after the next talk. So I think I go back to Tom now to introduce Lucy.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you for a fantastic talk and a really good, clear overview of an explanation of what is a specialist, a topic many of us, I suspect, are interested in. So for our third and final of the talks, I'm going to introduce Dr. Lucy Williams. Lucy is an anaesthetist who wears many hats indeed. She has a hat as a associate specialist in anaesthesia. She's got a specialist interest in pain medicine, working at the Great Western Hospital in Swindon. She's also college council SAS rep, has been there for nearly 6 years, coming to the end of her term there. And she's also, and the reason why she's talking today is she's one of the first SAS doctors to have become clinical director of an anaesthetic department. So she's going to talk to us with her manager hat on about what the specialist contract particularly means to managers and for the management point of view. So I'll hand over to Lucy to give us her talk about the specialist contract, the thoughts of a clinical lead. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Rob and Emma, for asking me to speak at this webinar. I was asked to speak about the specialist contract from the point of view of a clinical lead or a clinical director, but I very much have a foot in both camps here because I am an associate specialist, but a locally employed trust associate specialist, but I've also been the clinical lead for my department since November 2020. So I'm just finishing my term on Royal College of Anaesthetists Council, so I've been kind of plugged into what's been happening with the new contracts, although the college hasn't been directly involved in any of the contract negotiations, obviously. And I'd just like to stress that these thoughts in this presentation are very much my own. So we've already heard a lot of the detail about the specialist contracts that came out last year, but it's basically to ensure that there is a proper career development framework for doctors who have been kind of stuck for a long time and not really recognised for the great work that they do. The specialist contract requires at least 12 years since your primary medical qualification and at least 6 years in an SAS role or an equivalent specialty role. So if you look at the NHS employers or the BMA websites, there's quite a lot of useful information about these new posts, but it's worth pointing out from a clinical lead and trust employer point of view, the expectation is that specialists will meet a set of capabilities which have been laid out generically for all specialties. The college has developed a generic person specification which you can use in your advertisement. It's really interesting to note that these posts will be created at the discretion of the employer, where they have identified a specific workforce need. And those are slightly weaselly words because it means that people can say they don't have a workforce need or they have to make quite strong justification that they do have a workforce need. So these are not posts that people can automatically progress into. It's not a time served in a specialty doctor role and then you can say, well, I want to be a specialist now. These posts will only be available if departments advertise them, and you can apply when you see an advert, either for your own department or somewhere else. So the key question, I suppose, from a clinical lead point of view is that if you're already getting this level of work delivered by specialty doctors at lower cost, why on earth would you create a post for somebody else that was more expensive but would basically be doing the same job? And so I'm just going to present some of my thoughts about this. Another thing worth noting that your finance department probably won't tell you is that when the contracts were agreed in the negotiations, the additional cost of these new specialist posts, however many they modelled for, was included in the overall modelling costs for introduction and implementation of the new contract. Now, I don't have any idea how that actually filters through to trusts. I don't expect that individual trusts get a bit of extra money for this, but I haven't managed to discover that yet. In my experience, whenever you want more workforce or a more expensive workforce, somebody always tells me there isn't any money. So what about the role of clinical directors and clinical leads? It varies a lot between trusts. So some clinical directors have a great deal of autonomy over the budget that they have to spend. Some are responsible for not just the anaesthetic department, but theatres and a surgical directorate. In my role, I am a clinical lead specifically for the anaesthetic department and the intensive care unit. And I have virtually no budgetary autonomy, so it gets quite frustrating. I can't just shuffle things around. It involves lots of earnest conversations with the finance business partner for our division. As a clinical lead, I am always thinking about workforce. I never have enough of it. I am always in a recruitment mode, trying to find people at various levels within the department. I've got to balance the need for the service and what we have to deliver in terms of elective capacity, emergency cover out of hours, and also intensive care, which is a real struggle at the moment. Balance that alongside how to develop individual staff within the department. I have a lot of specialty doctors and other SAS grades in my department as a substantial proportion of the workforce, and I think that's true for quite a lot of DGHs in England, but there are definitely some trusts, often larger trusts, hospital, university trusts, where they have more trainees and therefore they have better rota fill without requiring so many SAS or locally employed doctors. I also have to work within what the trust tells me I can do. So if the medical director says I can't, or if the finance director says I can't, then unfortunately I can't, unless I make a much better argument for what I'm trying to do. So what do you get with a specialist, this senior SAS? As I've already said, you might already be getting it, but you can have senior cover within your rota tiers. So I would expect a specialist to be absolutely rock solid in obstetrics for my needs. Other job descriptions might not require obstetric anaesthetists. I would like somebody to be a senior resident person, so I'd like them to be able to do third on, to be able to help out in intensive care, to be able to deal with what happens in the emergency department. So I'm looking for a very rounded, experienced senior doctor. They would also be required to cover a range of elective lists and to be able to do that pretty much on their own. I would stress, and I think Rob's already spoken about, autonomous practice. I wouldn't expect necessarily that a specialist would never ask for help, because I wouldn't expect any of my consultant colleagues to never ask for help. You have to exercise your judgment, but you would be expected to be able to deal with most things that crop up on the average list. Sometimes you might have niche areas where you have trouble recruiting. So pain medicine is often hard to recruit into, and we are having trouble recruiting into intensive care. There's a sort of national shortage of people with intensive care skills at a senior level. There will be other sort of subspecialist areas in bigger hospitals where it might be difficult to get somebody who can really do that particular sort of list. These doctors can be trainers and educational supervisors, and that's either for anaesthetists in the training programme or locally employed doctors. So a lot of hospitals are having to recruit from abroad, and we need to give those doctors support to integrate and to develop and ensure that they're meeting the sort of progression requirements to be safe and confident anaesthetists. In my experience, now that I've been in a hospital for about 14 years, I think, we're seeing people come through and be appointed as consultants that we as SAS doctors have worked with as registrars and even now core trainees. So senior permanent staff, whether they're consultants or SAS, will be experienced in supervising and educating more junior colleagues. You should be able as a specialist to lead clinical areas, so subspecialty areas, but also to pick up and lead on non-clinical work. So there is a great need for this non-clinical work, however much trusts seem to squeak at how much SPA time is taken up with it. In my experience, there are not enough people to do all the jobs that need doing. So if you have got people who are willing and able to pick up roles, then this is another resource to dip into. I've already mentioned that SAS doctors can stay in one place for a long time, just as consultants do. That really contributes to organisational memory and continuity, and that's incredibly helpful, particularly when you have other roles within the hospital, particularly in management, where you tend to get quite a lot of regular turnover. So why, as a clinical lead, would I want a specialist post? So I have to have identified a specific workforce need. I would argue that if you've already got specialty doctors working in your department who are working at the level of a specialist, you have a demonstrable need for that level of anaesthetist. I also think it's the right thing to do, and sometimes we really should just do the right thing. This is a really key sector of the anaesthetic workforce. They should be recognised, and it will help with retention. Often people do kind of get stuck, and with no senior SAS grade, there wasn't really an opportunity for people to move on. There wasn't much incentive. But as more specialist posts are being advertised, there is a possibility that your senior specialty doctor might be poached by the trust along the motorway. There's also a huge amount of evidence that if you've got an engaged, happy, motivated workforce, you have safer care and you have better quality of care. Just a little aside into local associate specialist regrades. So very patchy, but in the Southwest, most of the trusts have done this. The problem we found in a lot of trusts is that not all those who were eligible to regrade actually succeeded in regrading. The systems were a little tortuous, time-consuming, and relied upon very, very busy people to try and find the time to do these things. And it didn't happen for some people, but it should have done. If, as departments, we can offer specialist posts in a competitive recruitment process, we can address this to some extent. So what are the options that are available to me, for instance? If I have an old style associate specialist retiring, which I do this year, or a trust associate specialist who retires or leaves, then you would want to replace like for like, so you could replace and advertise with a specialist post. I had a specialty doctor who left, and when she left, she was working at the level of a specialist, very much autonomously practicing. And I am in discussions to get that post advertised as a specialist post, again, pushing the fact that it's a like-for-like replacement in the work that the doctor is actually doing. If I replaced her with somebody who only had 3 or 4 years experience, I wouldn't be getting the same level of service, and they wouldn't be able to do the same level of work that the doctor who left was doing. You can use the specialist post as an incentive to recruit to a vacant specialty doctor post if you're really struggling to fill it. And in some parts of the country, they are very, very reliant on specialty doctors and SAS doctors to man the out-of-hours rotas, and it can be very difficult to recruit. So this is one way of trying to attract somebody. If you go down the route of demonstrating that your existing specialty doctors are providing specialist level service, and therefore you wanted to advertise that job, that's not necessarily the best thing for that individual in the post if you want to help them, because these posts should be advertised nationally and interviewed competitively, and it might be that somebody else comes in and has a better application or interviews better, and you don't necessarily want to lose somebody when actually the aim is to try and keep them and motivate them and promote them. So just to finish off, some do's and don'ts. Please do understand the new contract. Its main purpose is to provide career progression for those who are already in SAS grades. Use the college generic person specification. You can find it on the college website. Use the AAC process and get regional advisor approval of the job description. Make sure that the job description is accurate as a reflection of the seniority of the role, and it has to be advertised nationally. We've been keeping our eye on the adverts, or particularly Rob has been keeping an eye on the adverts, this I don't think is necessarily happening everywhere. I think there are some internal things going on, if you like, bending or stretching the rules. Please don't advertise for a specialist when you really need a consultant. So this isn't a way of getting consultants on the cheap. Although with recruitment difficulties, it may be that you haven't been able to recruit a consultant, and this would be a way of broadening the pool you can fish in to attract good candidates who may have most of the skills and capabilities of a consultant and may have enough for what you need. The other reason you might advertise for a specialist post is you've already got somebody who's essentially doing the job who wouldn't be eligible for a consultant post, but you do still have the issue then of competing with external candidates. Another thing that we have seen is advertising for a specialist post and giving them funny names and making them fixed term contracts. Specialist roles are permanent posts, they're not fixed term contracts. So if you are advertising a specialist post, it should be exactly the same as advertising for a consultant post. You're looking for somebody to join the team long term. So thank you for listening. If you've got any questions you'd rather address to me personally rather than in the live forum, then this is my email account and you will find me on Twitter as well. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a lively conversation.
So thank you very much, Lucy, for giving us the view from perhaps the other side of the fence, or someone else that foot on both sides of the fence. And I think many of us, perhaps as doctors working there, don't always appreciate the pressures coming on the other side. So thank you very much for our three speakers. We're going to have the panel discussion now. So I'm going to open up and ask all the panel members to turn their cameras and microphones on so we can see them. I have one more person to introduce, which is Dr. Leanne Davidson. She's an associate specialist in intensive care at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, and she's the Sas Committee BMA. She's a member of the BMA Sas UK, so the National Sas Committee, and therefore she's been elected from them to be our BMA rep on the Association of Anaesthetists. So we co-opt people from various different backgrounds and various different organisations to give us the benefit of their skills. So I welcome Leanne to the panel as well. So I'm going through the questions which everyone has submitted online. Some of them are very similar, as you can imagine, so I may group one or two together. And please forgive me, as you'll see me juggling several different windows at the same time. So I think we're on top of these things. So the first question, I'm going to target questions initially at specific people where I think there are benefits to one person, but then I shall ask the rest of the panel if they have anyone else wants in. So the first question is about very much T's and C's one. You can imagine they've come in the order of the talks. So I'm going to start with Emma asking, what about those who remain in the old specialty doctor grade who've reached the highest pay scale and beyond, retirement age, still working full time? I presume it's a question about pay progression and what will happen to doctors who are already on the top of the pay scale of the old specialty doctor grade. What happens to them with new contracts? Can you move when you're retired, so on?
Okay, thank you. My understanding, Leanne might correct me if I get this wrong, is that really if you don't move across the new contract, you stay on the top of you will stay on the top of the pay scale. It's only if you move across that there will be any sort of change. But I would have thought if you've already reached the top of the pay scale, there's little for you to be gained by moving across to the new contract. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does, yes. Leanne, anything from the sort of BMA T&C point of view with that?
Yeah, the only exception would be if, and there are a few still out there, if you were on a pre-2008 staff grade contract, you will still be eligible to apply for optional and discretionary points in your trust. But if you're on a post-2008 contract, as Emma has said, you'll move up the pay scale until the ceiling. You'll still get the DDRB uplifts every year, which the new contract, unfortunately, because it's a 3-year phased pay scale, won't be eligible for DDRB until the end of that 3 years.
Thank you very much. And I think it's worth noting that, of course, with these contracts, the right to stay on the old contract is only for existing specialty doctors and associate specialists. So if you move trust to a new job, whatever your current contract or current grade, you'll have to go on to one of the 2021 contracts. So that's worth bearing in mind if anyone's thinking of moving, to check all these things out. So the next question, again, I'm going to start with, I'll ask Leanne first, I think, because it's another T's and C's one. It says, will automatic pay progression stop for SAS on the old contracts, e.g. the specialty doctor 2008 contract?
If you're staying on the old contract, your pay progression points will stay open and have to be, as I think Emma had said, be turned off. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think it does. I think that's my understanding too, that you will just keep progressing as you would have done had the new contract not
Yes.
come into force.
Yeah, your terms and conditions stay the same. You just progress up the progression on your old contract, whether that's specialty doctor or specialist, associate specialist.
And of course, there's always been requirements for any pay progression point. It's just that we've always met them. The vast majority will always meet them, but it's never actually been an automatic right on pretty much any contract. So the next question, is anyone else want to come in on that point? So the next question, we're going to a different topic, and I'm going to put this one to Lucy first of all. And how can we encourage trust to create specialist posts? I think you've answered a lot of that in your talk already. I'll ask Lucy first and then Rob to give their views on how we can encourage more specialist posts.
I think it's really difficult. You just have to keep chipping away at it. So I'm still in relatively early stages, but it's a constant round of who you need to talk to within your division, and the medical director, and this is kind of not usually terribly high on their radar of important things when you've got COVID and 20 ambulances outside the hospital. So it is an enormous challenge, and that was why I stressed that for a lot of people, for a lot of departments, it's almost going to be easier to try and sort of make the vacancies that you have into specialist posts, so that theoretically you could move people sideways and upwards from the posts and free up those posts, and then advertise for specialty doctors to replace them, so you've got new people coming in at the bottom. But it's really difficult, and it will depend a lot on how much autonomy your clinical director / clinical lead has, because some have a lot and some have virtually none.
Right. Thank you very much. Rob, what would you like to add to that?
So obviously I'd agree with everything that Lucy has to say. I make a point of agreeing with everything that Lucy has to say. I guess I would start by saying that there are short-term and then there are long-term arguments here. So the short-term argument is clear recruitment and retention now. So at the moment, I would say that actually clinical directors who are canny have a short-term opportunity to steal talent from neighbouring trusts that may not exist when the contracts are more fully embedded. So if you are a clinical director, you could conceivably advertise jobs now and have a very good chance of poaching all the people that tick no and said that they haven't yet had this conversation with their medical manager within the trust they currently work in. So if 80+% of specialty doctors think that they could be specialists, but most of them haven't had this conversation with their own existing clinical directors, advertise a job. Some of them will move, possibly. I mean, geography is going to play a role for some, because a lot of specialty doctors are specialty doctors because they wanted geographical stability at an earlier point in their career. But for some who are in a position to move to another neighbouring trust, if you're the first trust in your region to create these jobs, people will potentially come to you. The other argument from a retention point of view is that, or possibly I'll counter the financial argument. If you are a specialty doctor who has completed 12 years as a doctor and 6 years as a specialty doctor, you are well past the midpoint on the existing specialty doctor pay scale. And if you have moved over to the new specialty doctor contract, you will have a hastened rise towards the top. So actually, the financial argument against doing this doesn't really stand up that much, because actually the short-term financial loss is not going to be as much for your existing senior specialty doctors as it would be for recruiting a new senior person from outside the trust. So you can recruit, but actually the retention cost, the financial cost of retaining people by doing this, perhaps isn't as much for an individual doctor as you think it is. Longer term, a lot of trusts have difficulty recruiting SAS doctors. A lot of trusts want SAS doctors, they advertise, they cannot appoint. Longer term, with my blue sky, pie in the sky thinking, I think that organisations that demonstrate that they will do this will have a greater likelihood of recruiting at the bottom as well. I think organisations that have a greater, who display willing and are prepared to recognise seniority where it exists, develop their specialty doctors to become specialists, and then facilitate them becoming specialists when the time comes, will probably find it easier to recruit new, inexperienced specialty doctors, because those doctors will be able to see how they can become senior doctors in your organisation. So longer term, you'll have people like me out there endlessly tweeting, and I'm already doing this. So people who've already advertised specialist posts are nudging me on Twitter to say they're now advertising for specialty doctors, and I'm doing exactly this. I'm drawing attention to organisations who have been prepared to recognise seniority in their existing specialty doctors, because I think those organisations deserve to get the next generation of specialty doctors. If they're prepared to make specialists and develop people, develop in-house talent to become senior doctors, they should get the next generation of junior specialty doctors as well. That's only fair and reasonable. So short term, recruitment and retention. Longer term, hopefully, again, recruitment, development and retention. I think there's an argument that goes beyond the financial.
Right, thank you very much. Emma or Leanne, is there anything you would like to add for that question or suggestions?
Just that hopefully market values and competition will definitely, I think, once one trust to advertise, and there is, as Rob said, a huge opportunity to poach not only specialty doctors that are working at that level, but associate specialists who have been unable to leave a job that they may be not terribly happy in, but would have to take a substantial pay cut and go down a grade to move. Trusts are now have the opportunity to look for a specialist post in another trust if they wish. So there's a huge opportunity out there for trusts at this point in time to poach from other trusts.
Emma, anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, no, I just would agree with everything everyone said. I mean, there's a workforce crisis everywhere. Everyone knows it. It's not going to be solved anytime soon. Training numbers have been reduced. I think something, isn't it, over 90% of departments are running with at least one consultant vacancy. I don't know the exact level for SAS vacancies, but it's not dissimilar, and it's also very difficult to recruit into that grade. So this is an opportunity for people actually to steal a march on other people and try to fill their departments at an earlier stage.
Yes, thank you. You can always try the guerrilla tactic of leaving the NHS jobs website open as much as possible on your trust desktop every time someone walks past, just to get the hint going that maybe you're looking elsewhere. But it is worth noting when Rob mentioned about geographical stability, which is exactly why many of us became SAS, is that for many of us, there is still the option to move. I mean, I work in West Yorkshire. It's a big urban area. There are 10 hospitals I've counted roughly within a sensible commuting distance of where I live. So, there are many places where actually, and trusts do not want to get left behind, as we said. So we've got our next question, which relates more to supervision. And I'm going to start this with Lucy again, I'm afraid. So you've heard up because it's asking a college question particularly. And it's talking about, says, does the Royal College of Anaesthetists inform their assessors attending interviews for SAS appointments, particular specialist appointments, the direct consultant supervision of some potentially successful applicants should be available? This could be relevant if contractual program of SAS appointments takes place away from main hospitals or on remote sites.
Can you just run that by me again,
It's asking
please?
about the college assessors attending interviews, which I believe is a requirement for specialist jobs as well.
Well, it should be. I don't know whether it's actually happening.
But it's not a requirement for specialty doctor jobs, I understand.
No. No.
Because it's asking here, it says about, will they mention if direct supervision of applicants should be available? Will the college advise whether consultant supervision for posts, and what's the college requirements about remote sites and consultant supervision?
Yeah, I think the college position would be that the college doesn't necessarily have a position on that as such. The college produces the supervision guidance, and Rob showed us the table of different sorts of supervision. The college tends to default to within local governance arrangements to make sure that people are doing the right thing that they should be doing locally. So people often hope that the college is going to have everything sort of nice and cut and dried, and you can do this and you can't do that, and these people can and these people can't. But actually most people don't fit neatly into the nice little compartments. So there are probably some specialists and associate specialists, I know there are, that you would be very happy to be working in quite an isolated location as the most senior person there. And there are other people who are on paper senior people that perhaps you wouldn't be so happy to have in that position. So I think it's a case of local governance arrangements and agreeing what the level of supervision required is. So I don't think you could say that a specialist can or can't work in those circumstances. It's up to that department to ensure that the appropriate systems and protections are in place for patients and for the staff.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have anything to add to that one? Rob, I imagine.
Yeah, again, you know, I feel it's very important to agree with Lucy as often as the opportunity presents itself. I would just say, you know, patient safety is paramount, and there are situations where a consultant colleague would be very uncomfortable working in a remote site. There are cases that shouldn't be done in a remote site that perhaps, you know, are. And I think, you know, it's important that, as Lucy said, trusts and organisations and departments create robust systems that make the system safe around all of the individuals that work within a department, rather than relying on individuals.
Thank you. Leanne or Emma, anything to?
Just not so much about the supervision, but the part of the question that was about college involvement on interview panels. I think you alluded to it, Tom. There's the Royal Colleges were consulted during the negotiations about the generic specific frameworks as to what consisted of specialties, and it was agreed that the Royal Colleges would send representatives to join interview panels for specialist doctors to assess whether the candidates meet the criteria, and they are then free to make a recommendation, but the final decision for the appointments will rest with the employers. The employers have to provide the Royal Colleges 8 weeks to find an assessor, should maintain lists which should ideally be from the SAS grade, and a few colleges have indicated that that is indeed what they will intend to do.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Emma, anything you'd like to add to this?
No, not particularly. I think everyone's covered it really pretty well. I mean, I think the issue of supervision has been I wouldn't say a thorn in our sides, but I think it's been a problem for a long time, and how it's defined. I think great steps have been made recently in trying to define it better and to get it to something that's actually usable. I found it often as something that can be sort of held against you as a SAS doctor, really, that you need supervision, but a consultant is legitimately asking for help. And I think that's a very difficult attitude to overcome, but I do think attempts are being made to do it. And as I said, the recent defining of it in a clearer way is helpful with that. But also, as I think Rob said in his talk, the emphasis really on good medical practice, it's beholden on all of us to ask for help when we need it. This isn't something that should be seen as being in any way a weakness or as saying, well, that's it, you need supervision. And so, as I said, I think as we go forward, that's a situation that hopefully will get more clarity and better resolution.
Rob, do you have something else to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think, again, from the patient safety slant, we need to be very, very careful here that actually, if we're telling people that the fact that they occasionally ask for help means that they are not independently working and that they therefore cannot be specialists, we are disincentivizing people who need help to ask for help. If organizations use this as the reason why they won't create specialist posts, because a senior colleague occasionally needs someone else to come and help with a difficult airway or with a difficult spinal, we are actively discouraging people to seek help when it's appropriate to do so. And I think it's really important that we don't do that.
Great, thank you. Right, the questions are coming thick and fast, so I'm going to speed up a little bit, and I might ask some of them now just to one or two people if I think we're going over things again. But following on from the independent autonomy, supervision, independence question, someone has made a comment about on waiting list, initiative list, especially at weekends, should an on-call consultant be providing support to SAS anaesthetists? Emma, would you like to start with that one?
Yes, I mean, that's a really tricky one, because it comes down to a lot of this is, well, I've got to be careful what I say, but it's like protectionism by consultants in terms of who they allow to do the WLIs in their departments. I mean, I think the general guidelines, and again, I can be corrected if I'm wrong, is that somebody should be immediately available for any anaesthetist when they're undertaking work. And so I don't think a WLI at the weekend is really particularly, is anyway viewed differently from your standard work in the week. They're still NHS patients, they're still within your trust. And I think most departments should have a system in place whereby somebody is available to assist you if you need it. I don't think the fact that WLI makes it any different from the rest of your working commitments.
Thanks. Anyone else would like to say anything to that one? So next question, someone said, I'm a newly regraded to a local associate specialist. Do I have to request to move on to the new SAS contract? I'll ask Leanne and Emma to answer that. So Leanne?
So locally appointed associate specialists tend to be outside of national terms and conditions. It is within the trust's gift to regrade those doctors if they so wish. The employer's discretion, as far as I'm aware. Most trusts are being fairly pragmatic, and there are, while the sort of trust grades and the locally employed doctors and the sort of non-standard posts are technically not eligible to transfer, many trusts are encouraging their doctors to move across, and that is to be welcomed.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So next question, I'm going to ask for one or 2 points on each person on the panel for this tip. It says, I'm a specialty doctor who's worked unsupervised on lists for the past 7 years. What should I do if my trust aren't interested in advertising a specialist post? Rob, what would be your tip for that person?
Well, I think we all, there is an eventual answer here, unfortunately, is that if you genuinely work somewhere that will not recognise you, if you've earned it and they will not value you, your only remaining choice is to decide whether or not you like your job enough to stay. And if you don't, you can form part of market forces by voting with your feet, because eventually some trusts will do this. Some trusts will do this. Some trusts will go out of their way to make it difficult for their doctors to be recognised as senior SAS doctors, because in doing so they have to spend a little bit of money. And if your trust is that trust, you have to make a decision as to what is more important to you, the recognition or the job.
Okay, Lucy, what would be your tip to that person?
Well, obviously, first of all, I would agree with Rob. I think that for many people, they do have an option of going elsewhere. If you don't, I think the BMA document about the difference between specialty doctor specialists and consultant is helpful. The college generic person specification is helpful, because if you can basically rattle through that and say, basically, I tick 95% of these boxes, you can make a strong case. But as I say, you've got this jeopardy situation where if the trust doesn't technically have the ability to just regrade you, they have to advertise the job, and somebody else applies for your job, you might find yourself not in a great position. So I think this is a real challenge, that that the option of regrading, that it has to be competitive, or it should be. I'm not sure that this is how it's being done everywhere, but it should be competitive, I think is slightly problematic. But yeah, I think if you're not getting anywhere, go somewhere else. Come to Swindon.
Home in the magic roundabout. And Leanne, what would be your top tip about if you think you're getting a job and it's not getting anywhere?
Gather your evidence, document. Look at the generic framework, see where you tick the boxes, make your CD, put your case forward. And most CDs, in my experience, Lucy, I don't know if you fit this box, but most CDs are analytical communicators. So if you have the data lined up and say, look, here's what I'm doing, here's why I meet that, and have that conversation, and then the decision will come down, I suppose, if you're meeting huge resistance, despite being an autonomous practitioner, despite taking on additional roles such as appraiser, educational clinical supervisors, and just trying to boost your portfolio. If you're not getting anywhere, then you have to, as Rob and Lucy have said, decide whether you have that chat with your CDS, say, well, I'm working at this role, you're not paying me at this role, so let's talk about how my job plan should look as a specialty doctor, and work to that, or you move to a more forward-thinking trust and employer.
Thank you.
Easier said than done, I know.
Yes, indeed. Emma?
I think there's two main things I'd do. One is I would phone up all the local hospitals, other hospitals that were local to me, have a chat with their CDs and see how much arm twisting of them I could do. And then I'd either use that as a bargaining chip or I'd move. I also actually would go to my LNC. I do know some LNCs have produced policies for the I don't want to say regrading, for sort of the reappointment process. And I would see if you have some scope within that to do it on a sort of trust level, which you can then use within your own department.
Brilliant, thank you very much. One very quick question, which should be an easy answer. Someone says, a question is, how many posts could a trust make for a specialist? Is there a limit? Now, as far as I'm aware, there is no limit. They could make as many as they could fund and justify.
I'd agree with that, Tom. Yeah, I don't think there's a limit.
This question, I think, will Rob be the perfect person to answer this one, is I haven't managed to find any specialist grade vacancies so far. Where could I find details of the vacancies? I was first of all suggest following Rob on Twitter.
Yeah, no, follow me on Twitter. That is how you'll get, probably before you hear about them anywhere else. I just wanted to come back to the last point very briefly. That actually several of the specialist posts that have been advertised so far have been open-ended. So several of the ones that have been put out have been exactly that, where there has been no fixed number that have been advertised. But it's clearly a department that is seeking to both recruit and retain. So they've advertised an open-ended number so that anyone internal can apply and anyone external can come in. If you're looking to see whether or not specialist posts are being advertised nearby, you will find it difficult, in no small part because despite all of my efforts for the last 8 months, NHS employers still don't have NHS jobs still don't have a filter. So if you're trying to search specifically for specialist posts, you have to actually set up an active search box in NHS jobs in order to look for them. And because unlike consultants, trainee, specialty doctor, and any other role within medicine, and any other allied health professional role, you cannot currently search directly for specialist posts on NHS jobs. I'm told that this is because their website is being updated, but it's been being updated for the better part of 6 months. It's starting to annoy me, I'm not going to lie. But yeah, no, if you're looking, the search terms you want are, you need to search for anaesthetists and anaesthetics as the terms, and you need to search for a pay scale over 70,000, so that will get rid of everything that isn't consultants and specialists. And you need to put not consultants. You can select words that you don't want to appear in the job title, so you can put not consultants. And that's how I've done it. That's how I do my searches. And twice a week, and usually on a Wednesday and a Sunday, if I remember, I do a search on NHS jobs and then tweet any that I find.
Brilliant, and we thank you for your service for that, Rob. And as ever, the local grapevine and gossip rumour is the way to go, because people know, make contact with your LNC, your regional SAS committees, use our SAS links scheme and make contact with your fellow SAS doctors, which is good for so many reasons around your region. This is more a sort of opinion question, I think, to the panel, because I'm not sure we can alter the outcome of this, but it's on that as 84% of those working as specialty doctors think they're already working as specialists, does the panel agree or disagree departments should be able to regrade without advertisement? What's the panel's view? Sadly, we can't, because that's not what has been negotiated. What do people feel should, it's very interesting in people's views.
Well, certainly, no,
sorry, I'll go to Lucy first and I'll come to Leanne.
Yeah, I wish we could, if people met the criteria, because the thing is that a lot of places haven't got so many young specialty doctors at the moment because they are recruiting lots of locally employed doctors on trust doctor contracts or clinical fellow contracts. So I think a substantial proportion of the people who are on a specialty doctor contract pre-2021 are by definition senior doctors, and we don't have the new blood coming through. Now there are all sorts of reasons for that, which would be a whole other webinar to discuss possibly. But yeah, I would very much like to be able to say, you're working at this level, you tick all the boxes. Yes, we'll just move you on to the new contract, but we can't at the moment. That's not the way it was set up.
Leanne, what's your
Yeah,
view?
I was just going to make a comment that traditionally regrading has always been a competitive process. Getting an associate specialist job was never an automatic progression, at least in the main part. It was very much you had to fill in an application form and have it approved. So I think people have maybe, because of the intervening time without having the specialist post, people have maybe forgot that it has always been a competitive post. There are still negotiations ongoing in the background with the sort of the joint negotiating committee meetings still happening between the trusts, the Department of Health and the BMA about trying to how the contracts are being implemented. And one of the items that's on the agenda for next week is about the wording around how specialist posts are advertised, to try and just make it competitive, but not not necessarily external posts or advertising. It can be advertised internally as long as it's a competitive process. So hopefully that, keep an eye out, that will hopefully be coming through if we can get that past the committee meeting.
Brilliant, thank you. That's great to hear that update. So, and Emma, what would your view on this issue be?
Yeah, no, I was going to say what Leanne said, really, that even in the days of the staff grades and the associate specialist, it was still it was by no means an automatic process becoming an associate specialist. Most staff grades didn't, and it was a difficult process then. That doesn't mean I think that was right though, and I do think a much more automatic process would be appropriate. And I think it is a shame that with the introduction of this contract that it actually has made it difficult. I think it's an unnecessary hurdle to talk about a competitive interview, and the implication it's then advertised externally. I think that's very difficult for people who've been loyal employees at a trust and then naturally want to progress to a more senior role and are told, well, we're going to have to advertise it to other people, and you might not. The sort of unsaid is you might not get it. I think that's very difficult, and I would have liked to have seen a much more inclusive way of doing this.
And finally, I come to Rob for your comment on this.
Well, as always, I'm going to agree with Lucy. I think it's really important that whatever this, I would have loved to have seen regrading. I would have been delighted to have seen regrading, because that would have allowed a lot of people, as you say, who have chosen a SAS career, but who have benefited from the geographical stability of a SAS career. It would have allowed people to transition within their own departments more reliably than what we've got. But I think the important thing is, whatever the process is, it needs to be fair, it needs to be robust, and it needs to be open to opportunity for people to actually progress. At the moment, the shortage of specialist posts means that it doesn't really matter what the process was. People are not progressing. This was designed to provide motivation and incentivization for specialty doctors to develop. That was one of the points, and that's NHS employers have put that in multiple documents, that actually the reason why there was a need of a senior grade was to provide motivation for career development and progression for existing specialty doctors, and to create a true alternative pathway to formal training. That's only true if there is opportunity to become a senior SAS doctor when you have become one. So I would have loved to have seen regrading, but if advertisement is what we've got, then we just need an awful lot more jobs currently.
Right. I think it's worth noting that while SAS issues are incredibly important to us, we are but quite small fry in the wider NHS workforce, and I suspect the regrading has much bigger implications for the wider workforce. I suspect we fall off the radar from that point of view. Right, here's a question to the panel. It says, do the panel think is a specialist a more expensive specialty doctor or a cheap consultant? What do the panel think? Lucy's going to look at pursed lips. I'm going to go straight to Lucy.
Do you know, I think it's something of both and yet neither. So to get to a consultant, you have either gone through the training program with a straightforward CCT, or you have done an equivalent training process that entitles you to join the specialist register. If you are an experienced specialty doctor, you may have covered a lot of the competencies of the curriculum, but by definition, probably not everything. But it depends on what the role requirement is. So for jobs that we've had advertised locally, the jobs were quite niche with very specified job plans, including things like neuro. Now, my specialty doctor cohort in a DGH wouldn't be able to apply for that kind of job. They were jobs that were advertised very much with present incumbents in mind. For most hospitals that have a more generic requirement for the skill set, I think they need a good broad cover of skills, which would include a lot of the out of hours work. I think some of the specialist jobs have been advertised with no on-call work, but I suspect that in some places we're going to, in my place, my personal experience, I really would like to get some on-call from people until they are of an age where you shouldn't be doing resident on-call. I'm sorry, I'm waffling a little bit because I'm thinking aloud. I think in some cases you will be getting a cheap consultant. So for instance, we are struggling to recruit intensive care consultants. There is a national shortage of them. Could I find somebody who actually would give me 90% plus of what I need from an intensive care consultant who could actually do the job if I advertised for a specialist? I don't know. But I already have somebody who's a locally regraded associate specialist who absolutely is doing the job. So they're effectively a specialist who's come up through the specialty doctor ranks. So there's overlap. It could be either or neither. Does that make any sense? Sorry.
I think it does. Anyone else want to group in their view? What do you think it is? Rob?
You know me, Tom, I've always got an opinion. I think that this question comes from a viewpoint of there only having been one tier, essentially, for the last 12 years. And I think this is something that we need to move past. Specialty doctors, specialists, consultants, we all have individual roles. And I think, you know, one of the reasons why questions like this are being asked and will be asked is because people have become used to the idea that specialty doctors are all senior doctors. And you and I, Tom, and I suspect Lucy, have also played a role in that, is that for years, in attempts to raise the profile of the grade, we've been talking about seniority of SAS doctors and how SAS doctors can take on leadership roles, can be independent practitioners. And we've been doing this, actively promoting the grade. And in doing so, we may have convinced some people that specialty doctors are in fact all senior doctors. And that isn't necessarily true. And actually, it needs to be open at the other end to more junior doctors. They need to know that if they are appointed as a specialty doctor with 2 years experience in specialty, when they've done 6 years, 8 years as a specialty doctor and become far more senior than they were at the beginning, there is a senior role for them to go to. And that's what this is, and that's how this is going to work, and that's how this needs to work going forward. So is it an expensive specialty doctor? No, because it's a more senior, more experienced and more independent SAS doctor than a specialty doctor should be when they are appointed. Is it a cheap consultant? Not really, because it's a different role as described by the BMA and by NHS employers, and actually we're not that cheap. So the cost of a new specialist is not that much cheaper than the cost of a new consultant. Over the course of the specialist's career, it will cost less to a department than a consultant will over the course of their career. But actually starting salary is not dissimilar, so it is not a cheap consultant. You know, it is a senior SAS colleague.
Emma or Leanne, anything to add to this?
No, I would agree with what both Rob and Lucy have said. I don't really see it. I don't really see it as either. It's you know, it's different, isn't it? And one of the strengths, but as well, it's been a weakness of the SAS grade is its heterogeneity. You know, you can be a specialty doctor with 4 years postgraduate experience. So that, my understanding is that's 2 years as a foundation doctor and 2 years in say a CT1 grade, to me it's still SHO. I'm afraid I'm in that old money. But so, you know, 2 years of an SHO post, you can be a specialty doctor, but then you've got someone at the other end who's got several years experience. So I don't think you can actually lump those in sort of to that sort of comparison, simply because across the grade itself it's so diverse.
Brilliant. Leanne, do you think that we're cheap consultants or expensive specialty doctors?
I think that specialists are appropriately recompensed for the knowledge and experience that they bring to their role.
Fantastic. So there's a series of questions which are quite specific sort of questions, which just require probably one person to answer if whoever knows the correct answer, if that makes sense. So I'm going to ask them to the panel and see whether knows the answer first. The first question is, most SAS doctors do meet the specialist requirements. Does this mean they can all be offered a new post? I think we've probably answered that, haven't we, already? That sadly, the answer is no, not at the moment. Anyone else want to add anything to that? Next one, quite specifically, it says, I've been a specialty doctor for 6 years, but one of which was on maternity leave. Does this year count for time in this grade? Does anyone know the answer to that? I would have to look it up.
I would have to look it up as well.
But I would have to check that. I mean, I know when because I did regrade in the window of opportunity, I had to, my career had lots of months on and months off, and I actually had to add up quite carefully the amount of time I'd done, and I think the times I was off did not count towards that at all. So I would assume it was the same.
I'm going to look that up for whoever's asked the question. I shall put it on my Twitter feed. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, I shall try and answer it in the next few days when if I can find the answer out. Okay, another question. I wasn't an associate specialist and I moved hospital, had to be demoted to specialty doctor. Should I be reinstated to specialist?
I think that it's kind of been covered. Yes, you're going to meet the generic requirements. You've got the experience, but your employer is going to have to show the workforce need and then advertise the job. But it sounds like they would be well qualified to apply for any and every specialist job that comes up nearby.
Okay, next question is about the contract and the moving across onto the new contract. It says, I'm a specialty doctor and expressed an interest in the new contract by the deadline. We all found out our current job plans ended and moved to new ones on the new contract, asked to sign it off. Is this how it works? Can I go back to my old job plan if I don't want to proceed? Lucy, I'm going to Emma with her LNC hat on. Do you know the answer?
My understanding is that you've expressed an interest. They've offered you what you would have, but you have the right to decline that and stay on your current job plan and contract. Yes.
That's exactly my understanding. That I believe you have to enter into good faith into the discussions, but if at the end of the day it doesn't work out for you, and of course there has been a big change given the fact the pay scales have changed, then obviously that does influence how you might vote for it. Another question is, I'm a trust appointed associate specialist. Can this be converted to a specialist post? I think we covered this. It's no automatic right, but trusts are encouraged to do so. Obviously, a local associate specialist post is not a nationally recognised post, but it would be good practice and people are being encouraged. Next one on the simple sort of questions is there pay protection if you move from core training, such as after CT3, into a specialty doctor role? Rob?
In my understanding of this, yes. So if you one of the nice additions to the new contract that didn't exist in the old contract is that there is pay protection for people who are moving from training into being specialty doctors. So your basic salary will not fall if you move to becoming a specialty doctor from training. However, at CT3 level, I'm not sure that actually that will gain you a great deal, because I think the new contract pay scale was designed with that in mind. So actually, I think when you move over at that kind of level, you'll probably find that the opening point of the specialty doctor pay scale is, broadly speaking, where you are anyway. I might be wrong about that, but it's worth looking. But yes, there is pay protection for your basic salary.
Okay, another question I'm going to put out to see who knows the answer to this. If anyone knows, can specialists who are not on the specialty register work in the private sector? I don't know.
As far as I'm aware, It's entirely up to the employer.
Yeah.
So if you're practicing autonomously with appropriate indemnity in an NHS hospital, the private hospital also extend the same courtesy to you. So it's entirely at their discretion as to whether anyone wants to employ you.
Yeah. Rob?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. It doesn't come down to your NHS work. It comes down to whether or not you can get practicing privileges with the independent provider, and that's true now as well. So if you were a specialty doctor and you could convince someone to give you practicing privileges to work in an independent hospital, you could do so. It's just breathtakingly rare. But yes, you could, but it's not going to be your NHS employee you have to convince. It's going to be Circle or whoever it is that owns the private hospital.
Emma?
I actually think the main stumbling block will be that the insurance companies won't pay you if you're not on the specialist register. So I think if you were to get practice privileges, I think you'd be able to do fixed cost patients, but I don't think insurance companies would reimburse you. It depends who you're indemnified with as well, because the different indemnifiers take a different attitude towards towards people not on the specialist register, doing private work.
Thank you, everyone. Right, so I think they're quite specific questions. So a few more generic ones to answer, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in the last 10 minutes. So I'll ask everyone to try and keep their answers reasonably brief. This question is, guidance from the Royal College outlined in their standards is that 1.5 SBA should be given to new recruits. The contract says 1 for specialty doctors and specialists. How should Royal College and Trust negotiate this conflict? Rob's got his hand up first.
So yeah, that was true of the old contract as well. And again, the Academy of Medical Royal College's document on this is quite old now and has said that you need 1.5 PA's worth of SPA time for appraisal, revalidation, and mandatory training. That's what everyone should be getting if you follow the AOMRC guidance, and that should apply to everyone who has to appraise, revalidate, and do mandatory training in a trust. Some trusts will offer everybody 1 SPA as core SPA, and that's consultants and SAS doctors. Some trusts will offer everybody 1.5. Where I think there is a bigger issue here is if you work in a trust that will give consultants more than specialty doctors and specialists for the same requirements of appraisal, mandatory training, and revalidation. If you work in a trust like that, they really don't have a leg to stand on. And I think your LNC, your SAS representative on your LNC and your LNC need to get involved and need to try and iron that out. Because from my viewpoint, and I know that it's shared by yourself, Tom, that actually, if that time is for appraisal, revalidation, and mandatory training, and the requirements of a SAS doctor are identical to the requirements of a consultant, then there is no good reason I can think of why it should be less.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Anyone else got a comment for that question?
Just to say that that's all very well, but we've been on at our local LNC for a long time about this. People have worked very hard for years and not made any progress, so it's disappointing.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add anything? Okay. I'm going to mix up the questions, to be fair, so I'm not going to go in order to try and get a good spread of questions, because I don't think we'll get through all of them. If we're not going anywhere, I don't want to move, and we're not getting a specialist job, should we say we can't do any more independent autonomous work? An interesting question. Lucy.
Well, you're supposed to have an annual job planning meeting every year with your clinical lead. So that's to be discussed in your job planning meeting about what work you will do. And if you are working at specialty doctor level and being paid at specialty doctor level, I don't see why you can't say, this is the work that I'm going to do, and I'm not going to do work that is specialist level. I think you'd be quite within your rights to do that.
Yep. Anyone else wish to add anything to that one? Rob?
It was almost the first you're on mute moment of the entire webinar.
It was. We've done so well.
I'm almost disappointed that I managed to find the button. I was just going to say, obviously, you know, I don't think any of us want to recommend that our specialty doctor colleagues cause trouble in order to make trusts recognise them. But equally, I do wonder sometimes if that's what's going to have to happen in order for places to recognise that they are, you know, your senior, experienced and independent specialty doctors should be specialists. And if you're not going to recognise them as such, well, then either they're going to have to go elsewhere to find that recognition, or they should be doing a job more in keeping with how a specialty doctor is described by the BMA and by NHS employers.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you. Right, I'm going to move on to other questions. If many junior specialty doctors who share obstetric or ICU resident on-call rotas with trainees often find more than 50% of their work is out of hours, even following the current rules, what's the solution? Who'd like to answer this one?
Well, I mean, I think again, it comes down to your job planning, your annual job planning meeting every year. Obviously, it's annual, where you have a discussion about the contents of your job plan, and it's written into the contract that there should be an aim to reduce this down year by year until you reach the mandatory maximum of out of hours component.
Lucy?
Yeah, I was good.
I'd just say that that's exactly what it should be. It gets quite complicated having rotas where you've got different people on different on-call frequencies, because we've got 1 in 8s, 1 in 12s and 1 in 16s. But it's not impossible, it's just bloody difficult. It is easier to have everybody on a 1 in 8, but that I don't think fits with the new contract, in my opinion.
Leanne?
Yeah, the protections were written into the new contract, which the employers have all signed up to, so they have committed, if not at least in the first instance, but going forward, that SAS specialty doctor and specialist contracts have that protection. But more than 40% can't be out of hours, you can't work more than 13 weekends, you shouldn't work 2 weekends in a row, and there's compensatory rest protection written in, but there is that kind of interim transition period where people are still sort of finding out how we're going to do that in practice, but it's not impossible. And if you're in that situation, obviously get your rota checked out to see if it complies, keep a diary, and have the conversation with your CD at the job planning meeting.
Brilliant. So one next question. That was it. So are non-clinical roles important for specialist posts for senior specialty doctors? What's the penalty? I think the answer is yes, but I shall see what people say to this in more detail. Rob?
For pity's sake, that button is defying me. I was going to say, actually, I think it's very important that, you know, a specialist is seen as someone who has the same opportunity to undertake non-clinical roles as a consultant colleague in the same department. You will be a senior member of the department. There should be an opportunity and an expectation that you will undertake such roles. Again, as NHS employers have said, you should, you know, there is an expectation, there is opportunity, but not every person is suited to every non-clinical role, and that doesn't mean that you could not be a senior autonomous clinician. So I would highly recommend to my SAS colleagues that they do get involved in doing non-clinical stuff. I think it makes life far more interesting as a SAS doctor, as it does for my consultant colleagues. What I would say is obviously aptitude is important. You shouldn't be shoehorned into something that you don't have aptitude for in order to tick a box. But that, you know, there are excellent SAS clinical directors, there are excellent SAS associate medical directors, there are excellent SAS subspecialty leads, there are excellent SAS appraisers, there are excellent SAS educators, and, you know, broadening our horizons is probably very important. It also makes it much easier, in my opinion, to demonstrate that you are working beyond the specialty doctor role if you have picked up considerable non-clinical roles that would otherwise be the remit of a consultant department, or it should do.
Lucy?
I would agree, absolutely, yeah. And I think also, if we're talking about senior doctors here, at the risk of being shot down in flames, just giving lots of anaesthetics all day, every day, you need a bit of variety. You need something to stretch you and develop you in other areas. I think it's really healthy. Just going through the AXA process ourselves at the moment, there is a great long list of, you need a lead for this, a lead for that, a lead for something else. I haven't got enough consultants to do that. We have to, this is an opportunity for the department to really get the value from all of its senior permanent staff, instead of constantly saying, oh, it has to be a consultant. You're just mad if you say that.
Right. Anything to add from Emma or Leanne?
No, just that that's what I was going to say, that actually it isn't really just about CDs, MDs, etc. That there's a huge list of roles that need fulfilling in any anaesthetic department. There's absolutely no reason why SAS doctors can't undertake these. I think historically it's been difficult for them to take roles on, or to be allowed to take roles on. But that's what I was trying to say in my talk, is possibly the advantage of the new contract, that for the pay progression, this is now listed as being necessary. And so actually it gives you more ammunition to try to persuade your leads to let you take roles on. And it's just important for you as a professional to have something else that's interesting to do. As Lucy said, just giving anaesthetics day in, day out, well, you know, we can all do that, can't we? But it's very important that you're allowed to offer skills in other areas.
We are coming right to the end of our time now. I'm going to squeeze in one last question, which I like a quick answer from for people, and I apologise to everyone else whose questions we haven't got through. Any specific, really obvious questions with an easy answer, I shall try and get through to answering on my Twitter feed in the next few days. So this question is there, I'm going to paraphrase slightly, but is there a specific ASA grade of which you'd expect senior specialty doctor to anaesthetise, and then for a specialist? Does anyone know this, or does anyone have a feeling on this? I don't think there's any guidance about this.
No, there isn't anything out there that I've read on that now.
No, I think it very much depends, again, like you say, on local policies, local supervision, your skill set. I would happily anaesthetise myself an ASA 4 patient for a trauma list, because that's my bread and butter work. I would not anaesthetise an ASA 1 patient for a neuro list, because I haven't done that for a long time. So brilliant. Yeah, I think that answers that question. We're not going to get through all the others, so I do apologise for that, but all it remains for me to do is to thank all of our attendees for coming and giving up your evening to attend this, and I hope it's been useful and informative. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our speakers and our panel for their talks. It's been a pleasure to hear everything. It's been really informative. I've learned a lot, so I think everyone else has done. You will get an email tomorrow, which will give you the instructions to access the recording, so you can watch it all again at your leisure if you want to. And for those of you who registered, well, I'm not sure what I'm saying because you won't be here, but for those of you who registered but couldn't attend it live, it'll be there. Please do complete the delegate evaluation survey, which is really important for us so we can improve our educational offerings. And please visit the association website for more webinars. There's one coming up on Anaesthesia Associates, there's one on airway, and there's also the airway webinar. But finally, thank you very much to our panelists again. Thank you to you for attending. Thank you to Andrew Mortimer at the Association for all his hard work keeping us running technically smoothly. Apologies for not answering all the questions, but we'll try and get back to answering all the final plea. Use our new link scheme. If we have questions we haven't answered, or things you think we should be doing, use your links, become a link, feed up to us in the committee, and we'll try and do our best to represent you as our members as we can. Thank you very much, everybody.